have young people who are willing to launch off early and do this for us. God bless you. That's always super when somebody is willing to do that. Bless you guys. John chapter 13, 12. John chapter 12, we're going to do 12 and 13. We're going to do 12 and 13 today. Remembering that the book of John is 21 chapters, every chapter covering a different aspect of the character of Jesus Christ. All of them in having a little bit different angle on who, in fact, Jesus Christ is. As we get into this 12th chapter, we remember that chapter 11 was the raising of Lazarus, which clearly outlined that Christ is king of life. I mean, he is the ruler of life. He is the ruler of life. He is able to bring life back. He is in charge of life. Whether it's an ant, a little ant on the ground, a whale in the sea, or whether it's you or I, Jesus Christ has power over life and death. In that particular story there in John chapter 11, we are at a point in the story here as Christ's ministry of 3 years unfolds and comes to a conclusion. Everything from John chapter 11 on to John chapter 21 all takes place in a time period of about 60 days. It's just kind of the last 60 days, might even be as little as 45 or 50 days, but it's the last few weeks of Christ's life here on earth. So he raises Lazarus. That's the story that happens there in chapter 11, and that outrages the religious leaders. The religious leaders are angered because Christ is doing things for people that they can't do, and he's not marketing them. And he is circumventing the legalistic Jewish culture that has sprung up around the faith. A legalistic culture has grown up around the faith that was given. And they have turned the faith that God gave them, they have turned it into a bondage. And because of that, Christ is creating much anger among them. And the chief priest has, in fact, in the end of chapter 11, the chief priest has issued an order, bring him to me. I mean, it really doesn't say it's an arrest order, but it is certainly a detain order. You find him, you get a hold of him, and you bring him back to me. Okay? That's what the chief priest wants at the end of chapter 11. So, as we jump into chapter 12, we need to know that there's a little bit that happens between 11 and 12. He actually leaves the area. People are already collecting. We learn that at the end of chapter 11. We learn that people are already collecting for the Passover feast. People are getting into town. Town is beginning to swell up as people are arriving daily to celebrate the feast of the Passover there in Jerusalem. But Christ does not stay. He leaves. He leaves. And we're going to follow him for the little bit that he is gone. We're going to trace him, and you find the missing pieces in the books of Luke and Mark. He makes this last little journey. He leaves Bethany and makes a little loop, not too big, comes back through Jericho and back into Jerusalem, all in the matter of a few days. But it's his last trip. It's the last trip he's going to make before the crucifixion. So he leaves Bethany, and we find him in Luke chapter 13 and verse 11 on another Sabbath day. Luke chapter 13, verse 11, brings us to the story. He arrives on a Sabbath day, and he finds a woman who has been doubled over. She has been caught in this crippled condition for 18 years. For 18 years, she has been forced to be in this crippled, crouched position. And he heals her. He heals her. And instantly, more religious leaders are upset. Oh boy. They are instantly upset. You did this on the Sabbath day. Now, it's obvious to me, Christ does so many things on the Sabbath day that it was not an accident. It's not an accident that he's there on the Sabbath day and that he heals her on the Sabbath day. He is clearly pointing out, and at one point in his ministry he says, Sabbath was made for man, not man made for the Sabbath. He points out that that extreme legalism does not lead to freedom, but leads to a bondage. And so here, when the religious leaders get all distraught with him, he says to them, now which of you does not loose your donkey on a Sabbath day and lead him to water and bring him back? Surely you all do, or you would be considered abusive. He said, now this lady has been tied by Satan for 18 years. Surely, even on the Sabbath, she deserves to be set free. So he does in fact set her free. Understand, most of the people that are there that day will be, or many of the people that are there that day, will be in Jerusalem in the next few days. So the religious leaders were upset, but the people were joyous. The people were joyous when they saw this lady released from the bondage of her crippling that she had had so long. They were joyous. They were exceedingly grateful. And they would be a part of that throng of people that we're going to see in just a few minutes as we go to the triumphant entry. These are people that are collecting toward Jerusalem. He leaves that situation and he goes to Jericho. And you pick that story up in Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10 brings him over to Jericho. We're getting closer and closer to the end. We pick it up in verse 32. We get some idea there of what's going on. They, the disciples in Christ, were now on their way up to Jerusalem, verse 32. And Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. He's done this. Jesus has told them what's about to happen, but right in the last minute, none of them get a picture of it. None of them have any real clue that he is about to hang on a cross. He tells them this. They hear it, but they don't get a hold of it. Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days, he will rise again. That's pretty plain. That's pretty plain. But even though he gives it to them that plainly, they will still be shocked when it unfolds. But here in Mark chapter 10, he makes that very plain to them. A few verses further on, we come to verse 46, and we see the blind Bartimaeus. When they came, verse 46, and they came to Jericho, and as they went out of the city of Jericho with the disciples, a great number of people, including blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the wayside begging. And when Bartimaeus heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out, saying, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. Blind Bartimaeus has been a beggar. He's blind, he's been a beggar. But he knows this is Jesus, the son of David. He's got it anchored in his heart. We are, in fact, in the Messianic period, in the Messianic presence. He is a believer, even though he has not yet received the gift that he's about to receive. He's crying out, and people are trying to say, don't bother this man. You be quiet. Do not bother this man. And Bartimaeus, as you go on reading, he says, he cried out all the louder. This is my one opportunity. You are not going to hold me. You are not going to hold me back. When will I ever see Jesus of Nazareth, or when will he ever come by me again? He cries out all the more. And Jesus asked him, what would you have me do? And he said that I might see. And Jesus said, your faith has healed you. Get up and go. Jesus is doing these things in these last days. These people will also follow now on to Jerusalem. They will follow on to Jerusalem, building the crowd and making the people aware of who Jesus really is, the enormous power that he has, and how he can bring them on into the faith as they move along. So, as you end Mark chapter 10 and go into Mark 11, it parallels with John chapter 12 as we go back to it and watch that Jesus is coming in. The 12th chapter of John, the theme that it points out is that Jesus is King. Jesus is the King. Jesus is the King. He is the King. Israel has had trouble with kings. Israel has had trouble with the concept of kings. Who is Israel? Israel is a nation that started from a single man, Abraham. Started from a single man, Abraham, who had a son, Isaac, who had a son, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and those 12 sons will eventually father 12 tribes, and there will be 12 tribes of Israel. Those grandsons will become involved there as we get into the technicality of it. But this becomes a tribe that grows into a nation. And in order for that to happen, God takes them into the land of Egypt. And there they find themselves honored for a while, and then they become slaves. They will remain slaves for 400 years. And during that 400 years, they will, in fact, become a nation. They will become a big number of people, in the millions. And everybody debates how many people that really is and one thing and another. But it's in the millions. All from one man, Abraham. They are now a nation of people. But they're in bondage in Egypt. God sends Moses to deliver them out of the bondage of slavery and back to the promised land of Israel. They follow Moses back. Moses does not enter the promised land, but in fact, Joshua takes over and becomes the leader. Takes them into the promised land. Once they're into the promised land, and once the promised land has been delivered to them, God goes before them. They get into military action, but God delivers them. God delivers them over and over again and gives them Israel. And once that is done, Joshua says, my work is done. Now go live and serve God. We then enter a period of time in Jewish history that we call the Judges. There is no central leader, but when invasions come, God sends a deliverer. And we call those people the Judges. That time eventually draws to a conclusion, and we begin to look at the time of the prophets. We have Samuel. Samuel becomes the prophetic leader of the people of Israel. And the people of Israel are looking at the nations around them and they say, you know what? Everybody's got a king but us. Everybody else has got a king. We need a king. Samuel says, you don't want a king. You don't want a king. Everybody else has got a king, yeah, but the king becomes a master over them. He will take your young men and put them in the military. He will collect taxes from you to finance his extravagances. You really don't want a king. God said he would lead you. You need to let God do this. And they said, thanks for your advice, Samuel, but we want a king. So God honors the request. They get Saul, who starts out good, but soon turns to be less than a great king. Then comes David, who is in fact a great king. Not a perfect man, but a great king. And he builds Israel to an enormous kingdom. Turns it over to his son Solomon, who God blesses greatly. And the kingdom of Israel is a mighty, mighty, mighty land. Levon was reading to me yesterday from one of her devotional guides that Solomon in today's world would be a trillionaire. He would be a trillionaire. Wow. I mean, it was big time. It was big time. Solomon marks the greatest point in the life of Israel. After Solomon, the kings become weaker and weaker and weaker and less godly. So that eventually the king they wanted so bad has allowed the land to dwindle until it's beaten by foreign enemies and becomes in bondage themselves. So the idea of a king to Israel is very important to them. I mean, that thought. God has promised a Messiah. God has promised a Messiah. He would be a deliverer. He would be a deliverer. If you can turn quickly to the book of Zechariah, which is just a couple of little books before you get to the New Testament. Zechariah, I of course have a paper tucked in there, so that it's really easy for me to find. But Zechariah prophesies of this coming Messiah, and he uses the language of the king. He will be God's king of God's people. In Zechariah chapter 9 and in verse 9, the prophecy comes out this way. Rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. Wow. Coming to Jerusalem. He is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt. Wow. An exact prophecy. This is written 500 years before Christ. This is written 500 years before Christ. And so the people of Israel have been looking forward to this now for a long time. For a long time, they've been looking forward to Jesus the King coming. And now in chapter 12, verse 9. Chapter 12, verse 9. Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back to Jerusalem. And when the people heard it, verse 9, when the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him, and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. Then the leading priest decided to kill Lazarus also, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted the religious leaders and began believing in Jesus. The next day, the news that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem swept through the city. A large crowd of Passover visitors took palm branches and went down the road to meet him. They shouted, "Praise God! Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hail to the King of Israel!" Jesus found a young donkey and rode on it, fulfilling the prophecy that said, referring back to Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, "Don't be afraid, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming, riding on a donkey's colt." Wow. The crowd was so thrilled. The crowd was so thrilled. The king, the promised king, had finally come. And they were descending into Jerusalem. And surely as they got into Jerusalem, they would go to the throne of Pilate and to the throne of Herod, government leaders, and they would say, "You're out of here." Jesus would cast out the king of the Romans. He would cast out the legal authorities of Rome, and he would set up his own kingdom. And the people of Israel would be so happy. Except that as Jesus got down to the bottom of the hill, he didn't go to Pilate's throne, and he didn't go to Herod's palace. Instead, he went to the temple. And there he drove out the merchants who were selling sacrifices at outrageous prices to rob from the common people. He drove them out. His kingdom was not the kingdom they were anticipating. His kingdom wasn't the kingdom they were anticipating. And that greatly, greatly, greatly disappointed people. And by the end of the week, many of them would turn against him. In chapter 13, we go on to see Christ as he kind of defines who he really is as a king, who he really intends to be. It's a sharp contrast to what we've just seen, because kings are not always humble. And yet chapter 13 shows Christ as a servant. That's the theme, Christ as a servant in chapter 13. I'll read those verses, John chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Before the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet. We're going to see, you already know ahead of me. You know where I'm going. Many of you know where this is going. What you know is going to happen is that in a minute, Peter is going to say, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Do you have any idea what this looks like or what this is? You are our leader, and yet here you are washing our feet." We don't wash feet much anymore. Paul and Pam, you old enough to remember ever being in the foot washing? Nazarenes used to do it. You ever get there? I was in the last one in my hometown. You remember it? Feet washing. It was a high event. I was there the last night the church in Yale, Michigan washed feet. They did it, 3 times a year, twice a year. Everybody would gather and they'd have all the women wash women's feet and all the men wash men's feet. And so here we were on foot washing night, and one of the church fathers didn't know it was foot washing night. And he had come unprepared for foot washing night. What's that mean? What do you mean you came unprepared for foot washing night? You got a great big hole in the back of your sock. That could happen. I don't know. It might be. You got a great big hole in your sock and you don't want people to see that? Oh, you didn't clip your toenails. Oh, man, you know how ugly the toenails on an old man can be. You mean you were out cleaning the chicken coop and you didn't have time to bathe? Is that what you mean? I don't know what he meant. But I know there I was, a brand new, saved 17-year-old kid attending a weekly prayer meeting, and we're doing foot washing, and this man says, "No, we are not going to do this." And I mean, there a great big open controversy swelled up right there in that meeting, and it was never done again. That was the end of it. I don't know what happened in closed doors in the meeting that followed, but we didn't do it that night, and it was never done again. That was it. Now, what was that? That was arrogance and pride. In Jewish history, you weren't expected to have clean feet. Jesus didn't expect them to have clean feet. Obviously, the servants washed their feet because their feet had been in the dust, and there they were in sandals, and you know how bad your feet can look after you've been in the garden with sandals on. And that's exactly what was there, no doubt. And Peter is about to say, this is reversed. This is not right. If we're going to do this, he's not saying it shouldn't be done. He is saying, we just honored you as the king. Now here you are, kneeling down in front of these other guys, and you are coming to me in a minute. And I'm not too proud. I am not worthy. I am not worthy that the king would wash my feet. So we'll go on with that. So he got up from the table and he took off his robe, verse 4, wrapped a towel around his waist and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. And when he came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you really going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand now what I am doing, but someday you will." "No," Peter protested. "You will never wash my feet." "No, you are not going to do this. Not because I'm too good, but because I'm not good enough." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't belong to me." And the next verse is one of the greatest verses in the Bible. I love it. Peter exclaimed, "Then wash my hands and my head as well, not just my feet." If that's the way it is, if I'm not going to belong to you without you washing my feet, then I don't want you to just wash my feet. I want you to cover me. Because I really want to belong to you. I really want to belong to you. We have two other places in Scripture where Jesus is speaking. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28. Jesus is speaking of humility. He said, "The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister himself, and to give his life a ransom for many." He declares that he intends to be a servant. In Luke chapter 22, we find it again. Verse 27, he says, "Who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves?" Well, the one who sits at the table, of course. But not here. "For I am among you as one who serves." I am among you as one who serves. So he is the king. He is the king who is a servant. If you're as old as me, the name Elvis Presley has special meaning to you, good or bad. But if you're as old as me, you were there when he came out with blue suede shoes on the platform and the way it went. And everything was history from that moment on. But the crowds, it was the birth of rock music. It was the birth of a whole different era of the way people went to concerts and everything else. And early in his fame, it got to where the girls would mop the stage, and it would be girls only in the first 15 rows of every concert, you know. And I mean, there it was, and so it really is a part of the life story that he was at a concert, and a row back, 5 or 6 rows back from the front, the girls had all gone together, and they made this great big long banner. And as he was singing, during the middle of his song, they stood up, all holding their banner. Elvis is king. And Elvis just stopped singing cold right in that moment. He just, boom, stopped it all. And when everything was quiet, he said, Jesus Christ is king. I don't know where Elvis was in his heart. I know that he struggled his whole life trying to get a hold of a faith with God. But I know that that moment, he knew that moment, he was not king. But that Jesus Christ is king. Oh, I pray that Jesus Christ is king in your heart. King in your life. That you pray to King Jesus. That you depend on King Jesus. That he is your king. The other thing we learn here is that there's absolutely no room for Christian arrogance. There is no room for us to lord it over anybody because we are Christians. Absolutely the opposite is true. We need to follow the Christ example of humility. Stand with me. We need to follow him in that humility that made him a servant unto all. And may we have that same concept in our own hearts, that we are here to serve and to help spread the gospel of Christ. Father, oh Lord, we acknowledge you as King. You are the King. You are the coming King. And a day will come when we will see you as King. But that day was not here on your first coming. Your kingdom is of a different nature. And I pray, Lord, that in the kingdoms of our hearts, we have all crowned you as King, and Lord of Lords, King of Kings, that we have crowned you, that you are ours. Father, and that we would follow you. You came as the King, and yet you were the servant unto your people. Oh Lord, may we have that same spirit. May we be willing, Lord, to serve and to bring people to you through humility and a gentleness. We will give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Remember, sign up to come tonight for the supper, 6 o'clock. Also, ladies, sign up to come to Clark. We'd love to see you in 2 weeks. Bless you. We'll see you tonight.